In an eastern Tennessee county archive, there still exists a photograph. It shows 11 people standing before a limestone house. They're all dressed in black. They're all smiling. And if you look closely, truly closely, you'll notice something that makes your skin crawl. Every face in that photograph shares the same narrow chin, the same hollow, distant expression, the same eyes. This is the Rutledge family in 1938. And by the time this photo was taken, for over 100 years, they had been marrying each other. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It isn't an urban legend. It's what happens when a bloodline decides it's too pure to let anyone else in. Hello everyone. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment with the time you're watching and where you're from. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this. The Rutledge family didn't begin as monsters. They began as survivors. From Virginia in 1796, 3 brothers named Josiah, Elim, and Silas Rutledge came down and claimed a stretch of land on the Cumberland Plateau that nobody else wanted. It was remote, rocky, and bordered by a forest so dense sunlight barely touched the ground. But the Rutledges didn't care. They built their homes close together, so close you could hear a conversation from one porch to the next. And they made a promise, a pact, really. They would never let outsiders dilute the family name. They would never let strangers inherit their land. And under any circumstances, they would never marry outside the bloodline. At first, this wasn't unusual. In isolated communities, cousin marriages were common. But the Rutledges took it further, much further. By 1820, every daughter born into the family was spoken for before she turned 12. The marriages were arranged quietly, internally, without exception. If a girl was born, she would marry a cousin. If she protested, she was reminded of her duty. If she ran, she was brought back. The family kept meticulous records, births, deaths, unions, all written in a leather-bound book passed down through generations. And in that book, for over 130 years, there isn't a single marriage to an outsider. But isolation does something to people. It doesn't just preserve bloodlines, it warps them. By the early 1900s, the Rutledge daughters stopped protesting. They stopped asking questions. They simply accepted that their lives had already been decided. They would marry a cousin, bear children, and raise those children to do the same. The family grew larger, but it never grew outward. It folded in on itself, tighter and tighter, like a fist that refused to open. And the daughters, those quiet, obedient daughters, became ghosts long before they died. There are stories the locals still whisper about, stories they won't say aloud unless they've had a few drinks and the sun's already gone down. They talk about a girl named Miriam Rutledge who tried to leave in 1912. She was 16 and engaged to her second cousin, a man named Thaddeus, who was 20 years her senior. The night before the wedding, Miriam disappeared. They found her 3 days later, wandering barefoot along the Triton, her dress torn and her feet bleeding. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, just sat in a rocking chair and stared at the wall until the wedding was rescheduled. She married Thaddeus 2 weeks later. And according to the records, she never smiled again. Then there was Adelaide Rutledge, who in 1923 gave birth to a son with no ears, just smooth skin where his ears should have been. The doctor who delivered him left town the next day and never came back. Adelaide's husband was her first cousin. Her mother had also married her first cousin, and her grandmother before that. By the time Adelaide's son was born, the family tree didn't branch anymore. It circled. It looped back on itself like a noose. But the Rutledges didn't see it as a problem. They saw it as loyalty, as purity, as proof they were different from everyone else. The town knew, of course. They knew. But nobody said anything. You didn't ask questions about the Rutledges. You didn't knock on their doors. You didn't make eye contact if you saw them in town, which was rare. They kept to themselves, and people were fine with that because the alternative, confronting what was happening up on that plateau, was too uncomfortable, too dark. So the town looked away, and the Rutledges kept marrying each other, year after year, daughter after daughter, until the whole bloodline started to look like a photograph left too long in the sun, faded, distorted, wrong. But in 1937, something changed. A girl named Constance Rutledge turned 18. And unlike every daughter before her, Constance refused to marry her cousin. She refused quietly at first, then loudly, then violently. And when the family tried to force her, she did something no Rutledge daughter had ever done before. She ran into the woods, and she didn't come back. For 3 weeks, the Rutledge family searched those woods. They walked shoulder to shoulder in lines, calling her name until their voices went hoarse. They checked every hollow, every abandoned shack, every cave they knew about. But Constance was gone. And the longer she stayed missing, the more the family began to fracture. Some said she'd been taken by animals. Others whispered she'd taken her own life rather than submit. But her mother, a woman named Edith, who had herself married a cousin at 15, believed something else entirely. She believed Constance had found a way out. The town started talking, not loudly, but enough. People began asking questions the Rutledges didn't want to answer. Where did the girl go? Why did she run? And what exactly was happening up on that property that would make a young woman choose the wilderness over her own family? The sheriff drove up to the Rutledge homestead twice. Both times he was met at the gate by Constance's father, a man named Garland, who told him in no uncertain terms that this was a family matter. The sheriff didn't push. He never did. And so Constance remained missing, a ghost in the woods, a name people stopped saying aloud. But then in the spring of 1938, Constance reappeared. She walked out of the forest on a Tuesday morning, alive and healthy, wearing a clean dress nobody recognized. She wasn't alone. Beside her was a man, tall, lean, with dark hair and eyes that didn't match anyone in the county. He didn't give his name, didn't say where he was from. He just stood there, one hand resting lightly on Constance's shoulder, and waited. And when Garland Rutledge saw them standing at the edge of the property, his face went white. The family gathered, all of them aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, everyone who still lived on that plateau. They stood in a half-circle around Constance and the stranger, and nobody spoke. Finally, Constance broke the silence. She said she was married, that the man beside her was her husband, that they'd been living in a cabin deep in the woods, far beyond where anyone ever went. She said she wasn't coming back. She said she was done. And then she said something nobody expected. She told them she was pregnant. There's a kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound. It's the presence of something else, something suffocating. That's what filled the air when Constance said those words. Her family didn't move, didn't breathe. They just stared at her belly as if it were a wound that had opened before them. Because in their minds, it was. This wasn't just rebellion. This was contamination. This was the end of everything they'd spent over a century protecting. Garland Rutledge was the first to speak. He asked the stranger his name. The man didn't answer. Garland asked where he came from. Still nothing. He asked if the stranger understood what he'd done, what he'd taken. And the stranger just looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, "She chose me." That was all. 3 words. But they hit the family like a slap, because no Rutledge daughter had ever chosen anything. Not in living memory. Choice wasn't part of the arrangement. Obedience was. Duty was. And now Constance had shattered it. Edith, Constance's mother, tried a different approach. She begged. She wept. She told Constance she didn't understand what she was doing, that she was throwing away her birthright, her family, her place in the world. She said the stranger would leave her, that he'd get tired of her and disappear. And then where would she be? Alone. Ruined. A mother with no name and no home. But Constance didn't flinch. She looked her mother in the eye and said, "I'd rather be ruined than be like you." And that was the moment Edith Rutledge's face changed. The sadness drained out of it. What replaced it was something colder, something final. The family made their decision that night. Constance was no longer a Rutledge. Her name would be struck from the family Bible. Her children would not inherit the land, and if she ever set foot on the property again, she would be treated as a trespasser. The stranger said nothing. He just took Constance's hand and led her back into the woods. And as they disappeared into the trees, Garland Rutledge whispered something under his breath that only a few people heard. He said, "She'll be back. They always come back." But Constance didn't come back. Not that year, not the next. The family waited, certain that hunger or hardship or the simple cruelty of isolation would drive her home. But the woods stayed silent. No one saw her in town. No one heard from her. It was as if she'd been swallowed whole. And slowly, the Rutledges began to convince themselves she was dead. It was easier that way, easier than admitting one of their own had chosen freedom and survived it. Life on the plateau continued as it always had. Daughters married cousins. Babies were born. The family Bible was updated with new names, new unions, new deaths. But something had shifted. The younger girls started asking questions, quiet ones at first. Where did Constance go? Is she really dead? Did she have the baby? And the family would shut those questions down fast. They'd say Constance was a mistake. A cautionary tale. A girl who broke the rules and paid the price. But the questions didn't stop. They just went underground, whispered in bedrooms, scribbled in journals later burned. The girls were watching now, and they were starting to wonder. In 1941, a census taker came through the area. He knocked on the Rutledge gate and was turned away, but not before he saw something strange. He saw a group of children playing in the yard, and he noticed several of them looked wrong. Not sick, exactly. Just off. Eyes too far apart. Fingers that bent at odd angles. One boy had a jaw that didn't close all the way. The census taker wrote it down in his notes, but his supervisor told him to leave it alone. Some families, he said, don't want to be counted, and some things are better left unrecorded. But in 1943, something happened the family couldn't ignore. A girl was born. Her name was Iris, and she looked exactly like Constance. Same dark hair, same sharp cheekbones, same defiant eyes. The midwife who delivered her said it was like seeing a ghost. But Iris wasn't Constance's child. She was the daughter of Constance's younger sister, Louisa, who had married their mutual cousin just months after Constance disappeared. And from the moment Iris was born, the family knew she was going to be trouble. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Iris Rutledge grew up hearing the story of her aunt. Not from the family, they refused to speak Constance's name, but from the silence itself. From the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. From the way her mother would stare at her, eyes sometimes filled with something that looked like fear. Iris learned early she was a reminder of something the family wanted to forget. And instead of making her quiet, it made her curious. By the time Iris was 16 in 1959, she'd pieced together most of the story. Constance had refused an arranged marriage. She'd run away with a stranger. She'd disappeared into the woods and never come back. But there was one detail nobody would confirm. Nobody would tell Iris whether Constance was alive or dead. And that absence, that refusal to give her a grave or a goodbye, told Iris everything she needed to know. Constance was still out there, and Iris was going to find her. She started walking the woods. Not deep at first, just the edges, the places where the family land met the wild. She'd go out after dinner and come back before dark. Always careful, always watched. But each time she went a little farther. She found old trails that hadn't been used in years. She found markings on trees, small carvings that looked deliberate, like someone had left a path. And one day in the summer of 1960, she found a cabin. It was small, tucked into a hollow so deep you'd never see it unless you knew where to look. The windows were shuttered. The door was closed, but there was smoke coming from the chimney. Iris stood there a long time, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she should turn back. She knew if the family found out she'd gone this far, there would be consequences. But she also knew if she walked away now, she'd never forgive herself. So she knocked 3 times, soft, but clear. And after what felt like forever, the door opened. Standing in the doorway was a woman in her early 40s. Her hair was streaked with grey. Her hands were rough and calloused. But her eyes were sharp and alive and utterly fearless. And when she saw Iris, she smiled. Not a sad smile, not a surprised one. Just a smile that said, I knew you'd come. Constance invited Iris inside without a word. The cabin was small but warm, filled with the smell of wood and herbs hanging from the rafters. There were books on the shelves, more books than Iris had ever seen in one place. There were drawings pinned to the walls, sketches of plants and animals and landscapes. And sitting in a chair by the fire was the stranger, older now, his hair touched with silver, but his eyes still dark and unreadable. He nodded at Iris but didn't speak. He didn't need to. This was Constance's story to tell, and she told all of it. She told Iris about the years of suffocation, the feeling of being slowly erased by a family that valued blood over breath. She told her about the night she ran, how she wandered the woods for days with no plan and no hope, only the certainty that anything was better than going back. She told her about finding the stranger, a man who'd been living alone in the forest for reasons he never fully explained, and how he'd offered her shelter without asking for anything in return. She told Iris about the fear that followed, the certainty her family would find her and drag her back. But they never did, because deep down, they didn't want her back. They wanted her erased. Constance had given birth to a daughter in 1939. A healthy, perfect daughter with no twisted limbs, no hollow eyes, no markers of the damaged generations of intermarriage had carved into the Rutledge bloodline. That daughter was grown now, living in a town 3 counties away, married to a man she'd chosen herself. Constance had broken the cycle, and she'd done it by walking away, by choosing the unknown over the familiar, by refusing to let fear make her decisions. Iris asked the question she'd come to ask. She asked if Constance ever regretted it, if she ever missed the family, the land, the only world she'd ever known. Constance looked at her for a long moment. Then she walked to the window and stared out at the trees. She said she used to have nightmares about going back, about being pulled into that house and locked in a room and told she'd imagined all of this, the freedom, the choice, the life she'd built. She said those nightmares lasted for years, but eventually they stopped. And what replaced them was something she'd never felt before: peace. Iris visited Constance 3 more times that summer, and each time she stayed a little longer. She learned how to identify plants, how to read the woods, how to live without needing permission. And when fall came, Iris made her choice. She told her family she was leaving not to find Constance. She never told them that, but that she was going to the city, that she'd found work, that she wasn't coming back. Her mother cried. Her father threatened. But Iris had already made up her mind. And on a cold October morning in 1960, she walked off the Rutledge property for the last time. The family continued for a few more generations. But something had broken. The daughters kept leaving. Some ran to distant relatives. Some married outsiders. Some simply disappeared. By the early 2000s, there were no Rutledges left on the plateau. The land was sold off in pieces. The houses crumbled. And the leather-bound family Bible, the one that recorded over a century of cousin marriages, was donated to a historical society, where it still sits today in a climate-controlled room almost nobody visits. But every now and then, someone opens it. And they see the names row after row of daughters who never had a choice. And they see the blank space where Constance's name used to be, scratched out so violently the paper tore. And if they're paying attention, truly paying attention, they'll notice something else. Written in the margin, in handwriting that doesn't match the rest of the book, are 4 words. Small, faint, almost invisible, but unmistakably there. Asterisk she got out alive. Asterisk.